Disinformation knows no borders, and today the stakes seem higher than ever. Welcome to Truth Talks, a bold podcast series tackling the challenges of fake news and propaganda head-on. Join us for engaging short conversations with experts from all EU member states and Ukraine as we uncover the truth behind dominant disinformation trends and explore the strategies shaping Europe's fight against manipulation. In this episode, we are zooming in on Latvia. Today's guest is Anete Bērzkalne, disinformation researcher and fact-checker at Latvia's Radio. Welcome to Truth Talks.
Hi, glad to be here. Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you for being with us. So, Latvia has long been on the front line when it comes to countering disinformation, especially given its geopolitical position and Russian language media environment. From your perspective, what are the dominant disinformation narratives circulating in Latvia, and how have they evolved in recent years?
I would say that in case of Latvia, there are many disinformation narratives that have been going on for a long time, specifically, as you already mentioned, due to the proximity to Russia, also due to the fact of our shared history, to the fact that also a large population of Latvia speak Russian, understand Russian, and, there are unique characteristics to the media landscape as well. But firstly, one of the longest kind of spread out disinformation narratives that has intensified since the invasion of Ukraine is the one pertaining to NATO, specifically the attempt to portray NATO as a weak organization in terms of its, high likelihood of it not protecting us in case of an attack. So basically, it's somewhat like installing fear into the people of Latvia that there's almost no sense in being part of NATO because it's not gonna protect us if Russia invades. That's one thing for sure. And to be fair, anything to do with security and defense in terms of trying to spread the sense that it is not good to poke the bear somewhat, right? If we're, securing ourselves more, it's provoking Russia. Hence, we should not do this. And of course, that's very beneficial for Russia, for us to be weak. That's one thing. Then we can see the influx of disinformation that is targeting the EU. And here, again, it's kind of multifaceted. On the one hand, it is being portrayed as kind of, the amalgamation of power between the big, strong countries like France and Germany, them basically dictating what's going on within the EU. And the small countries like Latvia and also, Lithuania, Estonia, basically not having a say in it. So basically, it's like this German-French dictated thing going on. And we can also see that, for example, if we look at the previous European parliamentary elections, that the voter turnout was pretty low. It was just below 34%. So it's kind of also people not fully understanding how the EU works. Can Latvia impact any, happenings within the EU? So it's kind of a mixture between not understanding fully how it works. And then, of course, if there is lack of information, then you can, influence people more easily. But then also, on the other hand, the EU is frequently portrayed again as a weak and basically fractured alliance, basically on the brink of, collapsing. And because Latvia also is frequently portrayed as a failed state, we are too weak to exist by ourselves, then the kind of conclusion that the disinformation is leading us to is the fact that we should find stronger alliances. And of course, who could that be? It's, the eastern flank, it's Russia, and kind of rejoining to the post-USSR space to that region. So we can observe a lot of that. Then somewhat tied to this and this kind of inability to be a proper state, it kind of also ties together with kind of ridiculing the Latvian state, the Latvian government. It's not always disinformation per se, but those are information influence campaigns, portraying, for example, the Latvian government as very incompetent, that we can't trust in their decisions. So hence it kind of enhances, distrust in the established system. And then, which is more targeting, I would say, the Russian-speaking population of Latvia, it's kind of the oppressing nature of the Latvian state and the alleged resurgence of Nazism and the liking of those. And we obviously have seen that in the case of Ukraine as well. But that is being portrayed as well. And we can see this also in current disinformation campaigns that are happening now as well. Well, the last one, the big one, which obviously that there are definitely more smaller ones as well. But since the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm sure Latvia is not alone in this, there has been an upsurge in health-related disinformation, which kind of is, turning against the traditional medicine. So there is a pretty strong anti-vaccination movement, maybe not as bad as in different other countries, but you can still see that being there. And of course, it not only can pose a risk to the public health and to, general society, but if you wholeheartedly believe that your government is wanting to poison you and kill you, then you probably are not going to believe in, their decision-making capabilities and their intentions behind various policies. So that by default creates distrust in the government. And also, if you believe in so much conspiracy theories, if you believe in one, that frequently leads to the belief in other conspiracy theories. And that, kind of everyone is against you and you can't trust anyone, essentially. So I would say those are like the kind of biggest disinformation narratives that have been strung out for a while.
Fascinating, and I have a lot of follow-up questions coming. However, I think you didn't mention Ukraine, so is that not also a context that is being attacked via disinformation, misinformation campaigns that Ukraine, as Latvia, in disinformation narratives that you were mentioning, is being presented as a failed state that we, for example, shouldn't support now?
Yes, I mean, Ukraine definitely is being targeted, but it's more so in regards to our support to Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees. So what we can observe is specific instances of disinformation which try to undermine the trustworthiness of the Ukrainian government and essentially leading to think that all the aid or like a chunk of aid that we provide to Ukraine is, for example, being sold to somewhere else and somewhat appropriated. It's not being used for the good of the people, for the war, but for like allegedly a very corrupt regime. And we, for example, recently there was a kind of upsurge in disinformation that the cars that we are donating to Ukraine, they're afterwards resold by Ukrainians and just to basically get money. So there's definitely disinformation campaigns that also like target Ukrainian refugees. But as we've seen a while ago, well, not such a long while ago, but there were leaked documentation from a social design agency, which is basically like a disinformation producing entity within Russia. And those leaked documents specifically indicated the intent to create disinformation narratives targeting Ukrainians within, for example, Poland, but also in the Baltic states, with the aim, of course, to reduce the aid. So yes, we can definitely see that as well. But due to the fact of, both Latvia and Ukraine have, the shared experience being under the, Soviet occupation, that I feel like Latvia's support to Ukraine, nevertheless, is very, very strong, and we give them a lot of aid and we perceive it as a, investment into our own security and the security of Europe. So whilst there are these disinformation narratives, I don't feel like they're as effective in terms of convincing people into believing that, we shouldn't be aiding Ukraine. I feel like maybe in bigger countries that don't have this shared history and maybe they don't relate on somewhat like more emotional terms, that could be more effective.
Now I would like to ask you about how much of these disinformation narratives are kind of bottom up, so that how much of them raise up from the level of the citizens that they actually have such ideas and they are being pushed up and spread further by malign actors?
That's an interesting question. I would say that it is more so up towards bottom rather the other way around. We can see that there is more so misinformation coming out from people when there is lack of information or void of information. And then, of course, it leaves space to speculation. If something is not clear, you're going to come up with your own explanations about things which are not necessarily true. And of course, it's kind of laced with the fact that there's a lot of disinformation coming from Russia. Russia is the primary source of disinformation coming to Latvia. Due to the fact that Latvians are very skeptical of information coming from Russia per se, so those disinformation narratives wouldn't be like pro-Russian in a sense that you would directly see that they're pro-Russian, right? Because we would be very skeptical of them. So instead, those narratives are by extension beneficial to Russia. For example, that's why I mentioned about Ukraine, right? It's not necessarily directly saying that, we should support Russia in this war, but like by not aiding Ukraine, we would help Russia to advance its geopolitical aims. These type of narratives, they seep into kind of the general kind of information space when I'm talking about, for example, social media, right? And then if it's done in an effective way, smartly, then people can perceive it, after it can convince them, right, to believe in certain narratives. And then they would continue spreading it further. But I would say that it's more so coming from foreign actors, which seeps into the information space. But of course, we also have, local actors spreading it. For example, how Russian deems them Russia's compatriots. And basically, there are ethnic Russians by their Russian definition, Russia's definition of compatriot policy, that either stay here or they also escape Latvia. They present it as a successful escape from Latvia, from Latvia's oppressive regime. And then they go to Russia or Belarus, participate, in media debates, in podcasts, and all of this. And they contribute to negative stories about Latvia, to disinformation, how they, experience this alleged resurgence of Nazi tendencies and whatnot. So, for example, they would pose as being like a true part of the society from the perspective of presenting the true sense of the people. But those are very few people, right? And they would pose as human rights activists, defenders, and whatnot. So that's another thing. But I would say that from, Latvia within, predominantly it would be misinformation rather than, disinformation. It's just confusion and lack of information.
Now, I wanted to ask you about major actors that stay behind creating and spreading disinformation. And you've already mentioned Russia. But what are the other actors? And also, probably Russia is also not like one big disinformation source. Maybe there are also different Russia-related actors.
I mean, Russia still does remain by far the biggest source of disinformation in Latvia. And again, as we discussed, is due to the fact that they don't really even need to do much from the perspective that by default, a lot of people speak Russian, right? So and that kind of creates the disinformation narratives more believable from the perspective, for example, if there is a disinformation campaign, for instance, in Germany, right? Then it needs to be localized in terms of, for example, it being German, right? Which already can language-wise, right? So if you translate it, it can lose kind of the trustworthiness of it. For example, if the translation is not the great and whatnot. But like in case of Latvia, frequently the campaigns, they're in Russian. There's even no need to like properly localize them. So they are by default the biggest disinformation spreader. And it's just due to the fact of the proximity, the language knowledge. A lot of people, they're using social media and, disinformation that is just randomly spread by Russia can reach Latvian people, even if it's not specifically targeting Latvia, right? So it's kind of a double win for them from that perspective.
In many other countries that we were analyzing within this podcast series, also internal actors are pointed at from time to time, like politicians, for example. What about Latvia?
I mean, yeah, there are definitely political actors that spread disinformation. And of course, the intention there is not fully clear whether it's misinformation or disinformation, because, maybe it's for, drawing attention to them. Now we will have a municipal election in June. So potentially it's for political gains. So yes, of course, there are local political actors, more so of, populistic leaning that spread false information. The example that I mentioned about Ukrainians selling off the cars that we are donating to them also was, multiplied by a political actor. So yes, absolutely, there's definitely false information being spread by people, of political background as well. And we do have a lot of, people, we have fact-checking kind of entities, and they do challenge them.
It was also what I wanted to ask you about. So what is being done to counter disinformation in Latvia, and what more would you recommend?
So Latvia's approach actually is multifaceted. So, for instance, Latvia's media watchdog has banned the retransmission of Russian and Belarusian TV channels, as well as different websites. By July last year, it was 142 TV channels being banned, and there are 200 domains, like websites, are banned as well. So obviously that reduces the exposure to, direct propaganda. Of course, it's still being spread via social media, but still, you can see there is, kind of beneficial impact from that perspective. Then as well, the state chancellery is responsible for countering disinformation on like more governmental level. And they have developed a centralized framework on how to respond to information threats, including disinformation. They've also, for example, created a platform which allows people to directly submit like disinformation cases, but also access different materials, educational materials. And they also, videos that they publish online to educate people. Then also last year, Latvia criminalized the use of deepfakes for election processes, right? And that I feel like points to the fact that Latvia is really keeping up with the times, and adapting pretty quickly to different information threats. Of course, there are various non-governmental entities that are dealing with media literacy initiatives, and basically, because it's a huge part of, how to make society more resilient to various false information campaigns. So I generally believe that it's, strong institutional strategic communication, it's media literacy initiatives, and it's also the strengthening of regional media, because of course surveys show that people have frequently higher trust in regional media due to the fact that they relate to the current problems, they understand the people better. So I feel that definitely there should be an increase in support to the regional media as well.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating. I think that other countries should look up to Latvia in terms of this proactive attitude. And coming back to another question, so a little bit of withdrawal now. I understand already what's the unique characteristics of the Latvian landscape in terms of fighting disinformation. But taking the step back, also, what are unique characteristics of the Latvian disinformation landscape, in your view?
Disinformation to be effective, it needs to be localized, right? It needs to draw from the local context. It needs to create emotional triggers. So it needs to be contextual. And you can see that, in case of Latvia, for example, now it will be the 9th of May, which in Russia's narrative and, in Russia, it's being celebrated as the Victory Day. But in Latvia, it's regarded as the day of reoccupation, right? So by default, it is known that it's a very divisive topic. So the exploitation of this topic and fear-mongering, the disinformation that, for example, Latvia is falsifying history, which is also, for example, being spread in Lithuania and Estonia, so from that perspective, it's not uniquely characteristic to Latvia, but still it's unique to the region, right? And it's, highly divisive topic within societies. So it's using these emotionally triggering narratives or like topics to sow discord, to polarize societies, because divided societies, when there's a lot of some kind of tension between various groups of the population, they're easier to target rather than if the country is strong and unified. So I think that's definitely one of the things. And I can see that frequently Russian disinformation kind of, uses these localized adaptations of things, which this was not uniquely targeting Latvia, but it's a great, like one of my favorite examples that Russia, it was discovered that in the Czech Republic, there was a website titled The Voice of Europe. And when I spoke to my colleagues and people around me, I asked them, what is the connotation mention here, what is the association? And it was Voice of America, right? And at the time, Voice of America was, the kind of source of truthful information, and hence Voice of Europe creates the same association as that would do. And then if you ban Voice of Europe, as they did in the Czech Republic, and then it moved to Georgia, but the narrative that comes out of this is, well, Europe is not democratic, right? It's behaving as the USSR did. And it's, using these small kind of, cognitive plays the people not directly maybe like recognize immediately, but there are associations there and there are emotional triggers. So I feel like the disinformation is not about just, presenting falsities and like fake information, but it's about the story that it creates, right? It always needs to fit in a larger narrative for it to have an impact.
Then the last question related to the answer of the Latvian government and independent organizations and the media against disinformation. How effective it is, taking into account all this disinformation, emotionally laden stories that you were now mentioning?
I mean, I hope it's effective. I mean, it's always difficult to evaluate for example, the kind of effect of false information campaigns, but also, countering them. I truly hope they are effective. I hope we reach people with this. And of course, it's always about more so about the people who are indecisive, right? If someone is really far into, for example, a conspiracy theory, me telling truthful facts are not going to work, right? Because it's a different narrative in which they don't believe in. So for people to believe in the truthful narratives and the, true facts, you need to build trust into the media system, into the system of the state, right? And we can see that, disinformation campaigns try to chip away from this, they're trying to portray us as untrustworthy, bought by someone, ruled by someone and whatnot.
Yes, we all hope that they're effective and that other countries will look up to the Latvian example. From what you're saying, it's very proactive and probably, hopefully, effective. So that brings us to the end of our conversation about the Latvian disinformation landscape. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk.
Thank you for having me.
Truth Talk series is part of the project Guardians of Truth, fact-checking during Poland's EU presidency, which is supported by European Media and Information Fund, managed by Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation.